Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. To celebrate Historathon 2023, I've created an original tag in which all the prompts derive from various ancient cultures and civilizations that fit into this quarter's time period, so prehistory to roughly 500 in the Common Era. Now, this is by no means an exhaustive list of the many interesting cultures and human civilizations that span that time period. In part because I'm hoping that Historathon cycles back next year and we get to revisit both this time period and perhaps this idea for a tag. However, there might be a few surprises among some of these cultures. So let's begin our inquiries. Prompt 1, the Romans. What books, writers, or genres are your bread and circus? And of course, I'm thinking about what are the books that we'd like to just disappear into, forget about the world for a minute. For me, it's crime fiction. So a writer like Tony Hillerman, mainstay in my reading for nearly 25 years at this point, and someone that I just really enjoy reading. More recently, John D. MacDonald, particularly Darker Than Amber. I just finished reading that this past week. I was reading it. My wife was listening to it in an audiobook while she would commute to her travel nursing assignment, and we were just talking about it. And so it's nice to just find my way back into crime fiction at any time. And certainly this is one that I enjoy. A writer like Agatha Christie, James Ellroy, David Peace. There are so many that I just find myself enjoying over and over. Prompt 2, the Sumerians. What is a work that you read so many years ago, but that you still appreciate? For me, I've mentioned this work before. I have a whole video on about it. It'd be my favorite penguin, but that would be the Histories of Herodotus. This book has had such an enormous impact on my life, on my reading. I've talked about the fact that my dad was a huge fan of this book, and so reading this specific translation by Aubrey de Selincourt still allows me to feel like he and I are close, even though he's been gone for 20 years next month, honestly. And so this is one that I read, I reread, and I discover something new to love and enjoy about it each time, particularly those silly digressions. But another book that would fit in would be Crime and Punishment, which I read when I was about 16. So we're looking right around 20 years ago. I read this for the first time. And it was really interesting to dig into this book. I remember reading part of it sitting at the mall while family members were shopping, and I had checked it out from the library and was just sitting down reading this book and realizing there was so much going on. There was so much to it. There were ideas that were being pushed out in the novel. And it made me start to think about, wait a second, if I pay close attention to what I'm reading, and I don't just pay attention to the plot and the story and sort of read for that story and then move on to the next story, but I pay attention to what's going on, I can start to uncover all of these ideas that are brimming beneath the surface. And it helped me return to other works I'd read in the past that had depth, had those ideas, but they weren't salient. And so I wasn't necessarily taking the time to dig in and figure out what was underneath that surface in terms of the ideas. So this was again a book that I think had a very outsized impact on my reading. Prompt 3, the Shang, an ancient Chinese dynasty. What is your favorite non-example to pillory? And I gave that prompt because Confucius loved to tear into the final king of the Shang dynasty. He references him multiple times as this example of a poor ruler, of someone who made terrible choices. And so, what's a non-example you like to pillory? Well, certainly for me, it's long been Anna Karenina and most of the works of Philip Roth. However, there's a new candidate. There's a new non-example that I'll probably be referencing in the near future. It happens to be a book that was originally written in Romanian, starts with an S, was translated into English very recently. That review will be coming soon. Prompt 4, early Basketmaker. This is a culture that became, later on, led to the ancestral Puebloan cultures here in the southwestern US, in North America. I've been able to visit a number of, certainly the ancestral Puebloan sites, the famous cliff dwellings, but I've also been able to visit some of the sites where they have, sort of traces of the early basket weaver culture, which is interesting because most of those sites really just have like small tools and things. And so it's sort of a local culture that fits in this time period. For this, I would like you to name an early work that points the way to later monuments for that writer. And I thought very seriously about talking about either Go Tell It on the Mountain by James Baldwin or The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, but these don't almost fit that prompt because they really are already monuments. They may not be the single best novel from either of those writers, but they're already such fully formed writers, so clearly pointing the way and existing as monuments fully formed in those very first works. So instead I went for these two. I Rocannon's World by Ursula K. Le Guin. I think it's the first of her novels that is really pushing out and doing something fascinating and interesting and drawing together all the different strands around myth, history, anthropology, science, speculative fiction, all of these different ideas that she has, and adventure certainly, and pushing them and pulling them together and fusing them into something that really is quite interesting. It is not nearly as powerful as her later Hainish cycle works like Left Hand of Darkness, The Dispossessed, even a later work like The Word for World is Forest. Despite being very short and compact, I think does quite a bit more than what Rocannon's World is doing. But Rocannon's World really does point the way to what those monuments will be in Le Guin's bibliography. So there's one for you. Another would be a writer I've discovered much more recently, and that's Thomas Bernhard. His second novel, I believe, is Gargoyles. And the second, roughly half of this book is this enormous monologue by an Austrian who's sort of a member of the former nobility. And it's just barely hanging on to any semblance of reality. And it is interesting, it is strange, it is terrifying at times. It is not nearly as powerful as Concrete or even Wittgenstein's Nephew, which is what we've been reading this month and having a wonderful discussion about. But I think it really does indicate the direction Bernhard is going to go as a writer. And it points in that direction pretty clearly. So I'd recommend that. Prompt 5, The Babylonians. What work did you expect to be impenetrable, but found quite easy to sink into? And I bring that up, of course, because Babylon had these formidable walls, these enormous defenses. And then the Persians and Medes just sacked it. It was absurd how quickly they were able to do it and how quickly Babylon just fell apart. So for me, one that I was shocked when I read the first few pages of, and yet found that I was obsessively reading when I read it, and I read it about 12 years ago now, gosh. J.R. by William Gaddis. This was recently republished by NYRB, and so it's been great to see all these other readers discovering what a wild and incantatory book this is. But the entire book is almost exclusively dialogue. There's very little narration about what's going on, and you don't even know who's saying most of these lines. You have to note the different voices and sort of draw them together to figure out where the characters are and follow along with them. This is a wild book. It is very, very funny. It is just brilliant satire. And I absolutely loved it. I had never really read anything quite like it when I first experienced it. And just absolutely loved it. So this is one. Another was a book I read about 13 months ago, and that's Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce. This book is incredibly dense. It is a series of word games in large part, and yet I found it to be an incredibly decompressing read. Just to bask in the language and hunt for a joke on every page, and the jokes are there. They were accessible, at least in my reading. So I think I honestly enjoyed this more than Ulysses. But moving forward from the Babylonians, it makes sense to talk about the Persians. So how do you organize your shelves? And I ask this because the Persians, particularly the Achaemenid Empire, was incredibly organized. The bureaucracy was truly formidable. The way that they were able to move resources and logistics, it really is quite incredible. So how do we organize our bookshelves? For me, I've been very open. I like to organize my shelves by publisher. It allows me to double stack in some cases. So I've got NYRB Classics. I've got my Heinemann African Writers series. Then I've got Charcoal Press, New Directions paperbacks. I've got Penguin Classics up here. Across on the other side of the room, I've got Vintage Contemporaries, Vintage International, Library of America, Penguin Classics, the Evermans Library. That's how I organize my shelves. But I'm curious to know how others organize their shelves. Prompt 7. I told you there'd be a surprise here. The Ashongo Bone from a Middle Stone Age culture. Sometimes it's called like Central African Foragers. Sometimes it's just called the Middle Stone Age African culture. We don't really have a name for this culture the way we do for some of these other very early civilizations and cultures. But the Ashongo Bone is fascinating, in part because it might be the earliest sort of math tool that we have from human history, and it came from Central Africa, from what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. And what's special about this bone is some of the early sort of numerical markings we have really range from 1 to 10. It's almost as if people like would mark through what they could count on their fingers, and then after that it was just stop, that's too much. But this bone has very clearly like 29 distinct etching, markings on it. And so it's interesting. It's broken. We don't know. Did it extend beyond 29, or was it perhaps? There are some theories that it is mapping a lunar cycle, perhaps even helping track a menstrual cycle or a fertility cycle by women in that culture. So it's this really fascinating piece, and it got me thinking about numbers, about the question: how does the length of a work affect our reading experience? I enjoy reading short works. I enjoy reading long novels. But how do we read those differently? When we get a longer work, do we like to take our time with it, or do we just want to almost grimly plow through it and have this Persian bureaucratic style of I've got to read this many pages every day to finish this book within a week or 3 weeks or a month? Or do we try to take our time with it? Do we binge read? When we have a shorter work, do we just rip right through it like it's a sprint? Do we take our time and try to uncover the meaning, unpack, and read as closely as we did with a larger work that seems to have more meaning and more significance? Certainly feels like a lot of us brag about the longer works we do. I've been doing that in this video. So I'm curious about that. I know for in my own reading, I try to gauge what I choose to read on any given day by how much time I have to read. So I might only have time to read for 15 minutes, and I might choose to read a short story or a single essay. I might choose to just read a poem. Honestly, the past 3 months taking graduate level math classes, it's been nice to read a work like A Year with Hafiz, where I can just open up the book to the day and read poems sometimes that take up the size of the palm of my hand on the page, and just think about the words, think about the language, the meaning. Other times, I've been pretty open about this. When I read longer works, I do like to space it out. I sometimes will read from a longer work roughly 100 pages a week and just take my time, especially those 19th century novels that were published over a time period of multiple weeks. Folks didn't have the ability to necessarily binge read those works as they were first being serialized. So I enjoy taking my time with those longer works. And I'll be honest, I'm often just in a flat out sprint on some of those shorter works, but I do try to pay attention. I do try to unpack the meanings, even in short stories, which I just absolutely love. So I'd be curious to know how the length of the work affects others' reading experiences. Prompt 8, the Huns, and we're ending up right at the 500 CE mark here. They barely fit into this quarter of Historathon, but how do you read or pack books while traveling? Because the Huns did a lot of traveling, a lot of other stuff too, but we won't talk about that. So I know some folks have their Kindle and their audiobooks. My wife's really good about these things. I'm the type of person who makes sure there's space in the bag or in the backpack for books, plural. Noah can attest to this, having seen me last March, that I had like a massive book with me at the time, but I also had probably 4 or 5 other books in my bag or in the hotel room. So I like to just have balance. I like to achieve balance with the books that I take on a trip. I like to have something that's longer, particularly if it's like a solo trip to a conference for education or math or something, and I'm going to have time on a plane by myself. I'll take something long and I'll just read hundreds of pages from it. I did that with Ulysses when I was flying to Chicago to visit my wife while we were long distance dating about 12 years ago. Read hundreds of pages from Ulysses on a pair of flights. But, I also will take shorter works. I've got to have my bread and circus. I'm bringing crime fiction. I'm going to have some book of essays or nonfiction. So I honestly just like to achieve balance when I pack. But I'm curious to know what others do. Do you leave space for the Huns' plunder? Do you leave space to acquire some books on your trip? I try not to, but I always end up finding something. Prompt 9. the Aurignacian culture, and this is the cave painters in Europe. And my prompt for this is, what are your favorite pop culture references to ancient cultures? And I asked that because I wanted to talk about the Caves of Altamira from Steely Dan. It's one of my favorite songs. I'm going to link the video or the music so you can listen to it in the description box below. But that's a song that very explicitly in the title references the cave paintings. In terms of film, I would say my favorite pop culture reference is probably the Cave of Swimmers in The English Patient. And then in other pop culture, the game Seven Wonders, which came out a little over 10 years ago, is a real delight to play. I just taught our older daughter how to play it this past weekend, and we had a great time. So this is one I highly recommend, particularly if you enjoy board games, you enjoy history. Seven Wonders is a lot of fun. So what are your pop culture references? Please share them. And finally, prompt 9, the Minoans. Establish some trade routes and tag some booktubers. So I'm going to tag a couple of folks who aren't necessarily doing Historathon, but I'd be curious to know their responses. So I'm going to tag Brian over at Bookish. He's a history guy anyways. I'm going to tag Quentin over at Idiot Reads and Rambles. We're going to get all sorts of weird transgressive responses on these. I'm going to tag a new booktube channel. She's made a few videos this month. Ava's Literary Parlor, and then I'm going to tag a bunch of Historathon folks here. Bill Rutenberg, Sean D. Standfast, Mariana Mas Books, Revenant Reads, Elizabeth over at Bookins and Books, in part because she started all those Literary World Cup tags. We'll tag Book Time with Elvis. We got to hear from Mark. We'll tag Triumphal Reads, Brian MR, who sort of started his channel, I think, in part with Historathon. I'll tag John David. I'll tag The History Shelf. And I will tag Read by Fred. So anyone, of course, is welcome to do this one. I really am curious. And let's see, maybe there will be something for 500 to 1500 of the Common Era in a couple months. Have a good one, everybody. Thank you.